Hi, welcome back. So let's get started with our Python calculator. Now, before we start actually writing anything, we're going to go ahead and install some required modules that we're going to need to use for this series. Now, if you don't already know what a module is, pretty much it's where somebody else, usually either the people who created Python or some third-party source, writes some code, and then you can actually include it and use it in your own project. So there's a lot of stuff that's really high level or it's very advanced and things that we can't usually interact with. So for example, in this series, we're going to be using the sys module, which is going to allow us to interact with the system. So we can exit the application and everything through the code. So that's one of the most useful features. Now, pretty much we're going to import these modules using a special bit of text that we can put in, and then we're going to start using them throughout the series. So let's go ahead and start importing our modules. Now the first one we're going to use, as I said, is the sys module. So all you have to do to import a module is type import and then the name. So in this case, you're going to type sys. Now there's no quotation marks around it or anything. It's just standard import and then sys. And once you type that, it's going to import our application. Now, there are many different variations of how you can do this. So for example, if you want to give it a name, you can say import sys as system, for example, or A or B. It can be pretty much anything that you want. And there's also another way to type it. So you can say from sys. So from this module, you only want to import a few things. Now, because usually modules have multiple functions or things that you can do to them, if you only want a very specific part of it, you can say this. And for example, let's just say from sys import exit. Now, sys.exit is one of the many different things that come in that module. And of course, you know, there are many different other ones, but in this case, we're only going to be using the exit part of our module here. So you can also do that. If you want to import everything into the namespace, so what I mean by that is because it's all classified under this one sys variable, you'd have to type something like sys dot and then whatever you want here. But what you can actually do is bring it into your main namespace. So for example, sys.abc would end up turning into just ABC. So basically, you're just taking it out of that namespace. So namespace, like I said, is just something that contains a bunch of things in it, and bring it into your local namespace. So you can use it without having to put anything behind it. So you can also do that. And in order to, if you want to do it for everything, you can just put a star right there. So that's enough for the modules. I'm just going to say import sys as a whole, and that is pretty much the only module we're going to use because the rest of it is going to be written by us. And if we do need to import any modules for something very specific, we can always go through and add it to our project later. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So today we're going to be setting up a little wireframe of what our application is going to look like. So before we actually start diving straight into it and writing a bunch of code, I actually want to lay out kind of what the process of our program is going to look like from start to finish. And the reason I do this is so that in the future I don't, lose my way and kind of go off topic and start, really going complicated and making things quite unorganized. So I like to do this before I start any of these projects so that I can kind of see where I want to be at each stage. So the first thing we're going to do is start writing our functions. Now, if you don't know what a function is, pretty much it's a way that you can pack up code in one kind of machine and then run that machine which runs that code. So for example, if you have 100 lines and you want to run that 5 times, it will be much easier to just run the function 5 times than to paste that 100 lines of code over and over again. So that's what we're going to be doing now. So the pretty basic syntax of writing a function is def for define, and then after that you're going to type out the name of the function. So I'm going to say func here. You're going to put 2 parentheses, and then you're going to put a colon, and then in here you're going to type out whatever you want. Now you can also pass in parameters for this. So pretty much what you can do is that, let's say we wanted to print happy birthday to someone. and we wanted to make this custom to each person. Now, let's say we have 10 people and we want to sing happy birthday through our program to 10 people. Now, obviously, you're not going to write 10 different functions. So what you can do here is, for example, if I'm writing my happy birthday function, so I'm going to say happy birthday. Instead of just writing it 10 times, so happy birthday 1, happy birthday 2, I could put in here name. Now what's going to happen is I'm going to end up using this name variable in my function. And when we call the function, which is to start running it, so when I go like this, which is the kind of syntax to run a function, I can pass in the name. So for example, I can say John, and eventually what will happen is this function will take whatever is here, which is the value passed in for name, and use it. So we'll start seeing some evidence of how that works later on, but for now we're just going to write out all the functions without putting anything inside of them. So the first thing we want to do is an introduction. So I'm going to type out def introduction, and we don't want to pass in any we don't need to pass in any arguments to this. Since of course it's an introduction, it's just going to be printing some basic text. So what we're going to do is then inside and make sure it's indented. So you just hit tab or hit the tab key once and it will make sure it's indented. So you want it to be inside this block. So pretty much just anything inside a function needs to be on the right block. So you can't just type it here, you have to hit tab to tell the program that it's running under this function. So here what I'm going to do is go ahead and type pass. And what this is going to tell Python is just ignore whatever's out here and keep going. Because if you don't type this, it's going to crash the whole program. So the next thing I want to do is go ahead and print the different operations that we can do. So I'm going to go ahead and say print instructions. Now you could say that we want to do this in the introduction, but I like to keep things as separated as possible to make sure each function is doing its job. So after that, we're going to ask for the user input. Now, if you watched the video at the beginning showing what the final product looks like, you'll know that this is command-based and not option-based. So we're going to say here, get user input, okay? And we're also going to type pass, remember. The next thing we want to write is something that can parse the user's input. Now, pretty much what's going to happen is the user types in what they want and it's returning a string, but there's no actual way to tell what the user wants to do. It's just a string. So what parsing pretty much means is breaking something down into its core components. So when we're parsing the string, we're pretty much just going to get what we want from it. So in this case, we want to get the operation and the numbers. So I'm going to say parse input, and of course this needs to take an input of string. And remember, because what we're going to be doing is calling this function, and every time we want to parse an input, we want to take in a different string every time. So we're going to do that and say pass. So now we're going to say def run operation, and what we're going to do is actually just leave this blank. Well, we're not going to leave it blank for now, but we're going to be doing something using a class. So we're going to be doing that in just a little bit. But for now, we're not going to actually define the class. So this is going to run the operation. So it's pretty much just going to check, what numbers we have, what we need, and it's going to get the returned, it's going to get our result for us. And finally, after that, it's going to take our answer from here, and it's going to say return, answer user, or yeah, answer user. Of course, you can name these whatever you want. We're just going to pass in our answer, remember, because what's happening is we're running our operation, and then the number that we get from our operation, which is, for example, 1 plus 2 is 3, we're going to pass it into here, and it's going to give it back to the user. And of course, the last thing we want to do is ask again. So what this is going to do is ask the user if they want to play or run another operation. So now what we want to do is define a class. And pretty much what this class is going to do is for every operation that the user wants to run, it's going to have a set list of variables. So it'll make more sense once I start writing this out. So what I'm going to do is call the class something. So I'm going to say class operation. Okay. So what we're going to do now, and pretty much what this is, oh, actually we don't need to put our parentheses here, just class operation. Now what we're going to do once we get in here is we're going to write something called a constructor function. So pretty much what a constructor function is when you run this class, what's going to happen is it's going to create kind of like a blueprint, and in this blueprint are going to be a bunch of different things. So for example, if you have a user class, it's going to have a set list of things that you need to make a user. So for example, a username, a password, and an email. And what happens is you can create an instance of the class, which is just kind of like a movable, workable piece of the class. And this is going to contain a specified username, password, and email. So we're going to do something using the init function. So you go underscore underscore init underscore underscore. And the first thing you want to pass in is self. Now, this is you always need to pass this in when you're creating a class. And pretty much what the self means is the instance that you're working with. So for example, if we wanted to set the user's username, you're going to say self.username. And again, don't worry about the dot, but pretty much what that means is you're going to set the username of that instance. So you always need to pass this in. The next thing we're going to do is pass in the operation that we want to run, like that, and then the list of numbers. So remember, this is just the blueprint. We're not actually creating this in real life. We're just going to be using this later on. So here what we're going to say is self dot, remember I was talking about that before. Oh, whoops, spelled that wrong. Operation. And here what we're going to do is set what we want. So it's going to be equal to operation. Now remember, self.operation and operation are two separate things. This is a pretty good example of a parameter or an argument being passed in. We're taking whatever we get from our class operation and we're passing it into here. So self.numbers, so these are the numbers attached to our instance, are going to be equal to numbers. So there we go. We have our operation class here. Now that we have that set up, what we're going to do is just finish this off and add one last function. Whoops, forgot to put up pass. And pretty much it's going to be called the main function. Now the main function is going to take everything that we wrote up here and we're going to pack it all into something nice and clean, very easy to read and easy to work with. For now, we're going to say pass. Now notice how nothing is actually being run here except the import. We can't print anything, and you actually only need one line to run this whole program, which is just like that, main. You're calling the main function. Now for now it doesn't have anything inside it, but as we go on, it's going to have more and more things. So let's just go through and debug, make sure there's no problems in here. And you can see that no errors have been returned. There's no problems or anything, so it looks like all of these functions are ready to go. So there we go, that's it. In the next video, we're going to be moving on and we're actually going to start writing some of our program. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So in this video, we are going to be creating, or in this case, we're actually going to be fleshing out the first two functions over here. So what we're going to be doing is first writing our introduction, and then we're going to be moving on and doing our instructions. So this is the first time we're actually writing inside a function, so I'm going to take it a little bit slow for the beginning, and then after that, I'm going to go through and start speeding up with our print instructions here. So pretty much what we want to do in our introduction function is give the user something to start off with. So for example, welcome to the calculator, or maybe we print the name of our calculator or something like that. Now it's going to be printed in our command line here. So we want to make it a little bit interesting, something that actually looks a little bit decent. But before we do that, the main way that we can do this is through a print function. So it is a function just like the ones we're writing here, except it's already been written by the people who made Python. So this interacts directly with our terminal, and what the print statement actually does is goes through and outputs whatever we pass into here into whatever we have in our terminal. So let's start with a little example. I'm just going to say print hello. Now, this is a very basic thing to do. What I'm going to go through is now in my main function, which is the only one that's being ran, is we're going to type in introduction. Now, what this is going to do is call our introduction function. And it's pretty much just going to say to the program, let's go and get this introduction function and run it. And then what's going to happen is we're calling this main function. So it's going to tell the program to run the main function, and then the main function is going to run the introduction function. I know a lot of functions there, but pretty much what's going to happen is everything inside main is going to be run, and therefore everything inside everything in the other functions are also going to be run. Now, it might sound a little bit complicated, but once I start running it, you're going to see it for yourself. Let's go ahead and type that, and you can see that hello is outputted to our line here. So one thing I overlooked before I started this is these quotation marks. Now, we're talking about a string in this case. A string is, just think of it as a word or a series of characters. So we can't do math with this or anything, which is why we need to parse it later on. But for now, we're going to work with strings. Now, you can use either double quotes or single quotes. For Python, it doesn't actually matter, at least until you start making substrings and things like that. But for now, we're just going to go with our double and single quotes. So we're going to go ahead in here and print out our calculator. So I'm going to say Python calculator. Now, we're not actually going to do any really cool formatting or anything special. We're just going to leave it like this and leave all of the formatting for the video later in this series. Now, all we have to do for our introduction is print this out. Now that we have our introduction function set up, let's go ahead and talk about our print instructions function. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that from our function here, and I'm actually going to go through and start working with just these, and we're going to leave the main for the end. So let's go ahead and print the instructions. Now, one thing I didn't talk about yet is a variable. Now, think of a variable as a cardboard box, and you can throw something inside it and store it. So, for example, if I wanted to store a word, I could basically take this and give it a name, and then whenever I want, I could take this name and use it to get whatever's inside our box. So all you have to do this is type out the name that you want. Now, you don't put quotation marks around this because it's a variable name. You're going to access this straight through the program. So what I'm going to do is type out my name. Now, for example, in this case, it's going to be our instructions. So I'm going to say instructions is equal to, and then in here, we're going to type out whatever we want. So we're going to type out our instructions into here. Now, of course, we're going to make it a word, so we're going to use those quotation marks again, and now we're going to start typing out our instructions. So let's go ahead and start this up. First thing I want to say is a little bit of how to run the program. So in this case, I'm just going to go and say type your command in this format, like that. And I'm going to put a space there, and the reason is we're actually going to add something on, and I'll show you what this is going to do in just a second. So now we set this type your command in this box right here, or type your command like that, or whatever. We're taking this string and setting it or giving it a name. So instead of having to just type this out every time, we can just type instructions and get the same thing. But one thing you can do is actually modify these things later on. So one thing we're going to talk about now is string concatenation. Now, this is a little bit of a difficult concept to understand, so just pay attention. Pretty much what we're going to do is take two strings. So in this case, it's going to be type your command in this format and the actual format, and we're going to glue them together using a plus symbol. So I'm going to say instructions, or for now, I'm just going to go with new instructions. So remember, we're creating a new variable is equal to instructions plus, and then in here we're going to put out our command. So we're going to say, for example, add 1, 2, or 1, 2. Let's just say that. So pretty much what's going, well, we can do pretty much whatever we want here, but this is just a basic example. So here we go. What's going to happen is, or let me just remove that space, is we have our instructions, and we're going to get whatever value is in there. So it's going to be this, and we're just going to glue it on. So it's going to read out, type your command in this format, space, add 1, 2. There's no spaces added in between, so you need to add those yourself. So that's kind of how it's going to work. Now pretty much what we're doing is storing this in a new box. But why do we need to do that when we can actually just modify it? So we're going to go instructions is equal to instructions plus this. So what's happening is we're actually changing what's inside our instructions variable. So there's actually a much easier way to write this without having to type instructions twice. All you have to do is type plus equals, and this means exactly the same thing. So now we're going to go ahead and start doing this for the rest of our instructions here. So what I'm going to do is keep adding things on. So I'm going to say instructions plus equals, and I'm going to put a space here, and I'm going to say possible operations. Now we're going to say for now the 4 main ones, so add, subtract, multiply, and divide, just like that. So pretty much what we're doing is adding or concatenating this string, because we're adding multiple substrings or pieces of a string and then throwing it together to create one long sentence. Now we're going to do formatting to make this look nice later, but for now this is all we need. So the last thing we want to do before we move on is print the instructions, because we haven't actually printed it yet. We're just storing this in a variable. Now, the reason I wanted to use print statements, variables, is instead of typing that whole thing out, you can just go ahead and type print instructions. And from there, it's going to take whatever we've modified and changed over the video and print it out. So let's go ahead and just test this out. I'm going to use Control/ in Sublime Text to comment this out, and I'm going to run print instructions. So when I comment something out, it pretty much just stops it from running. So you can pretty much type anything here and it won't recognize or it won't register. Let's go ahead and run it. So now it prints this whole thing out. Type your command in this format, add 1, 2, possible operations, and whatever. Now later on we're going to put in new lines and make this look all fancy, but for now this is all we need to do. So there we go. We've created and messed around with these first 2 functions, and over time we're going to be doing the rest of them. It is going to get a little bit complicated. This is kind of basic for now, so once we start getting into operations and classes and all sorts of stuff like that, it's going to get a little bit harder, but for now this is all we need to know, and now you can go off and print your own statements, create your own strings, and you also know what variables are. Alright, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So in this video, we are actually going to be working on the next 2 functions for our calculator. So in this video, we're going to be working on collecting our user input, and then we're also going to be working on parsing that input. So we'll explain that in just a second. Now, before I get started, I just want to talk a little bit about how functions work. And I know I covered it a little bit at the beginning, but we didn't actually talk about the whole operation. So a function is going to have 3 parts. The inputs, the main body, and then the outputs. Now we know that we have our inputs and our main body. So for example, this print instructions program doesn't take any inputs, and it has its main body, which just prints out the instructions for our program. But there's also another part that we didn't talk about, which is the outputs. So let's say we want to write a function that multiplies 2 numbers. Now we're actually going to be doing that later on once we get to the operations part. But pretty much what we can do is actually take in 2 numbers, so that's our inputs. We have our main body, which runs all of the logic and stuff behind it, and in this case it's just multiplying the numbers, and then we can return the product of those 2 numbers. So that's going to be our outputs. So we can do this, and this is pretty much just the general theory for all functions. It's kind of how it works. Now we're actually going to start to work with outputs over these next 2 functions, so that's what we're going to be doing in this video. So let's get started. Before I start writing on any function, I like to kind of think about what I want to achieve by the end of it. So in this case, I want to be able to ask the user to input their command, and then I want to take that input and return it, or I want to output it. So first thing we're going to do is think of a way that we can capture the user's input. Now the easiest way to do this is through the input function, which is a built-in function that allows us to get some text or input from the user. So we're going to just type it out first. Now I'm not going to store it to a variable yet, I'll do that next. And then what we're going to do is input a string here, and what that's going to be is kind of the text before the user inputs. So it's going to be, for example, in this case, enter a command, and then the user can enter their command. So that's what I'm going to type out here. And make sure to always put a space so that there's a space between our input here and the user's command. There we go. But we need a way to actually capture this or store this so that we can return it. Because what's going to happen is the user is going to enter their command, and this input function is going to return or output whatever the user typed in here. So we're going to store this to a variable. So I'm going to say user input, like that, is equal to input. And then what I'm going to do is just return it. So we can do this using the return keyword, and this is just pretty much just going to be a way to specify what we want to output. So I'm going to go user underscore input. There we go. So let's go ahead and test if this works. I'm going to remove this and say get user input. Now I'm going to go ahead and run my program. So it says here enter your command. We can just type in whatever we want for now. We enter it and it quits the program, which is exactly like how it's supposed to work. So the next thing I want to do is work on this parsing function here, which is going to be a little bit more complicated. Pretty much when we want to parse something, we want to kind of break it down into its key components. So in this case, we want to take that command, which is just a string, and we're going to extract all the information we need from it. So first thing I want to do is just change this from string to user input. So I think that would make a lot more sense. And the next thing I want to do is think about how I want to approach this. So the easiest way to do this is to kind of look at how we want to break it down. So I'm actually going to just write a little comment here. So let's say I have the command add 3050. We want this to output, oh, whoops, didn't mean to do that. We want this to output 80, right? So we have add 3050 to 80, but we can't do that with just a string. We need to break this down into different components. So we can see here that we have two major components. We have the operation. So I'm just going to make another comment there. So we're going to have the operation, which is in this case add or multiply or divide. And then the next is the number list. So the next is going to be a list of numbers. So this can be 2 or more, and it's going to be 30 and 50 in this case. So what we want to do is find a way to break down the string and get all of our key components from it. So here's kind of what we want to do, and this is a really good way of breaking down really complex functions, is kind of type out a comment list. So I'm going to say split string into operation and numbers. Split numbers, so remember we're going to have a string for our numbers into, okay, hold on, let me reword this. Make list of numbers that is easy to work with, because remember we have a string here and we can't really run math on a string, so we're going to break that down. And the final thing I want to do is create instance of operation class based on what we get from these upper lists here. So let's just look at this one more time. Pretty much the first thing we're going to do is split our string into its operation and numbers. Then we're going to make a list of numbers out of what we have from here. And then we're going to create an instance of our operation class. Now, if you don't know what a list is, I'll cover that in just a second. But let's focus on splitting down our string. So what we're going to do first is create a new variable. So I'm going to say, let's just say something really basic. User operation. This is also going to be temporary, so don't worry about the name so much. User input parsed. Okay, and now what we're going to do here is run user input. So we're going to say dot split. Now, pretty much what this is going to do is this is a function that's attached to user input. So split is going to take an input. So in this case, I'm going to put space, and what it's going to do is split up our string here on every space, and then it's going to create a list. So a list is pretty much just, well, a list of items. Now you're usually going to find it with square brackets and commas. So for example, A, like this, B, and C. This right here is a list. So this is a list of 3 strings, A, B, and C, and then we can do stuff with this. But in this case, our list is going to look a lot different. So in this case, our list is going to look like this. The first string is going to be add, and the next is going to be 30, 50. Because remember, we're splitting it on our spaces, so we have 2 parts to our list. The next thing we want to do is make a list of numbers. So what we're going to do is take the second element from our list. Now the easiest way to do this is to use the index, which is the position. Now the index of an item always starts from 0. So this is going to be item 0 and item 1. Now because we know that user input parsed is a list, what we can do is go like that, put square brackets around it, and say 1. So this is a way of accessing the index of something on a list. So when I run this, this is going to grab the second element, or the item with the first index. The next thing I want to do is split this one on a comma, because remember, we have 30, 50, and we're going to store this to another variable. So we're going to say user input numbers. This is kind of stretching off the screen a little bit, so I'll just see that. So we're splitting this on a comma. But the next thing we want to do is actually go through and convert this into something that we can work with. So what we're going to do is use a for loop. Now a for loop is pretty much just going to go through, hold on, let me just show you what the list will look like here. So a for loop is going to go through some iterable item. So an iterable item is pretty much, just think of it as something that can be looped over, or where you can go over each element. So a list is iterable, so you can go 30, 50, and you're going to go through each item and then do something with it. So the way to write a for loop is for, and then you're going to type some random variable name. So I'm just going to say for number in numbers, or sorry, user input numbers. So what this is saying is for every number, now this can be a name for anything, it's just a placeholder for whatever item you're on, in some list. Now what it's going to do is go through and do something with each number. In this case, what we want to do is set the number. So for example, if we're on 30, we want to change it to a number and not a string. So the easiest way to do that is say int number. So what this is pretty much saying is for every number, change it to the number version or the integer version of whatever we're specifying. So first it goes through 30, the string, and changes it to 30, the number, and then it does the same with 50. And if we have more items in the list, it's going to do it with all of them as well. So there we go. We have that set up. We have our user input parsed. So that's going to be our list of our operation and our basic numbers, and then we have our user input numbers. And after we run this operation, it's going to give us the number version of this list, so 30 and 50, without the quotations that are usually given to a string. The last thing we want to do is create an instance of an operation class and return it. So remember, we're going to output it. So the way to create an instance of a class is to go and type the name of the class. So in this case, it's operation, then put brackets around it. Now what you're going to do is pass in everything that you need to create this class or this box of items. So if we look at our init function, which is kind of our initializer, what we need to get everything set up, it takes in 2 inputs, not 3, because this is the self. It's referring to the instance that it's on. It only needs 2. So what we're going to do is pass in the operation that we want. So in this case, it's add, and the number list. So let's go ahead and do that now. First thing we want to do is store it to a variable. So I'm going to say operation is equal to, and then we're creating an instance. So the first thing we want to pass in is user input parsed. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and make sure to set 0 to get the first element from this list, which is add. And the next thing I want to do is set the second to our number list. So it's going to be user input numbers. And finally, the last thing I want to do is return this operation. There we go. So now you can see that we've completely finished our parse input function. It's going to get our user input, and then after that, it's going to parse it and return us an operation. So why don't we go ahead and test this? First thing I'm going to do is store this to a variable. So I'm just going to say user input is equal to get user input. So remember, we're going to store the output of this function to some variable. And then what we're going to do is print, right? So we're going to print something. And we're going to print the output of parse input, which takes in an input of whatever we got from this. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. First, we're going to enter our command. So I'm going to say add 3050. And now, although this might look weird, this is kind of the sign that you should get. It says an operation object, which means we are getting an operation back. If we want to check this a little bit more thoroughly, we can actually go and print a piece of the class. So you can say the operation that is stored under, what we actually need to do is parse input, because remember, this returns our operation. And in fact, just to make this a little bit cleaner, I'm going to remove this and store this under an operation variable is equal to parse input. And then what I'm going to do is print the operation dot name. So operation dot numbers. So what this is going to do is get our operation, and then it's going to take the numbers from here and print it. Let's go ahead and see if this works. Add 3050, and you can see it prints 3050. Now don't worry about the strings. We will be fixing that in a later video for debugging, to point out a really kind of nasty part of bugs here, or for loop, sorry. So we're going to be fixing that in a later video, but for now we've set up our two functions and we're going to keep moving forward so we can start working with this. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So in this video, we are going to be focusing on the next function for our operation here. So we're actually going to be taking our class that we created in our parser here, and we're going to be throwing it into our run operation. And once we do that, we're going to go forward, take the operation, and actually run whatever we want. So for example, in our add 3050 here, we're going to return 80. So we're going to add 30 and 50. So we know that we now have an operation returned from this function, which is going to have the operation that we need and the numbers. So let's go ahead and do this. Now pretty much the way that I'm going to do it is check through all of our different operations here. So I'm going to say if it's equal to add, or if it's equal to multiply or divide or anything like that, and then we're going to run the appropriate operation. So let's get started. Now we know that we can access the operation by going to operation dot operation. So this is a little bit confusing, so I'm just going to say task. So I'm going to replace this with task instead of operation. So what this is going to do is access the operation that we need. So for example, this can be add, multiply, or divide, right? So this is how we're going to access it. Now pretty much what we're going to do is check if it's equal to add, run something with the numbers. If it's equal to multiply, run something with the numbers, and so forth and so forth. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I'm going to do is check through the 4 basic operations that we need, which is add, subtract, multiply, and divide. Now the way that we can do this is with an if statement. So I can say if some condition is true, then we can run a certain statement. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and say this right now. If task.operation is equal to add, and notice how I put 2 two equal signs there, and that's actually for the equating one side to the other. So you're not really setting it when you're running this, and if you want to check if something is equal to the other, you need to use two equals. So if this right here is true, then we put a colon and make sure you have an indented block. We do something. So what I'm pretty much going to do is run a for loop through our numbers list. And once I do that, I'm going to go and add all the numbers together. So pretty much, let's write it down in pseudocode. Set a variable for the final answer. So at the start, this is going to be equal to 0. Okay? Loop through numbers list. So I'm going to loop through the numbers list, and for each number, it to the final answer. So this obviously can vary based on what we want to do. So for example, if we are trying to subtract, we're going to subtract it from the final answer. And obviously it can change depending on what we want to do. So for example, we couldn't just subtract it from 0 for each answer. We'd have to change it based on what we want to do. So let's go ahead and do that. So first thing I want to do is obviously set our final variable. So I'm going to say answer is equal to 0. Okay. The next thing I want to do is loop through my numbers list. So I'm going to say for number in, and we're not going to put numbers or anything because we're looping through the one we have in our operation. So we're going to say task dot numbers, just like that, colon, and now we're going to say answer equals answer plus, and then our number. Now we can actually just shorten this down into answer plus equals number. So what this is going to do is just say add number to answer. So this is going to loop through, and at the end of it, it's going to give us our number. Now obviously, we're only going to return our answer depending on each one. So for example, here, I'm just going to return the answer straight from our function, and it's just going to skip all of our other steps. So there we go, we did that. Now let's go ahead and focus on the next one. So if task.operation is equal to subtract. So what we're going to do here is focus on subtracting. Now instead of focusing on setting the answer to 0, we're actually going to set it to the first number. So for subtracting 30 and 50, we want it to be equal to -20, not 0 minus 30 minus 50. So that's what we're going to do. And well, we can actually do this for all of them, but it's going to make things a little bit complicated. So I'm setting this to 0, and for this one, we're setting it to the first number. So we're going to say our answer is equal to task.numbers and then 0. So just like that. And what this is going to do is select the first number from our operations here. Now what I'm going to do is run my for loop. So for number in task.numbers, just like that. And now what we want to do is focus on making sure that our number is not subtracting directly from itself. So for example, if we set our answer to 30, we don't want to go 30 minus 50, because that would just give us the exact same thing. What we want to do is make sure that the number that we have selected is not equal to our answer. Or actually, in this case, we want to set it to task.number 0, because our answer is going to be constantly changing. So what we're going to say is if number is not equal, and this is how you write the not equals, by the way, to our task.number 0, just like that, then what we're going to do is subtract it. Answer minus equals our number. So this can definitely pose a few problems, and we're actually going to be fixing those at the end of this video, so just stick around and I'll explain them once we get there. Now we're going to focus on multiplication. So we're going to say if task.operation, oh, we forgot to return it actually. So after we do all the answers, we're going to return our answer. if task.operation is equal to multiply, then we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to say answer is equal to task.numbers 0, because again, if we set it to 0, what it's going to do is just multiply 0 by this and by this and by that, and it's just going to give us 0. So we're going to do that. Now we're going to go for, and we could just pretty much copy this actually if we wanted to, and including our thing right there. So for number in task.numbers. So this is going to loop through each number, and as long as it's not equal to the first one, what we're going to do is answer multiply equals, and then our thing right there. So we're going to go number. And the final one is divide. So we're just going to go ahead and do that again. But before I do that, so I don't, really take time towards the end of the video, you can kind of see a little bit of a problem there. Let's say we have two numbers, 30 and 30. Now, pretty much what's going to happen is if we're trying to subtract the two, the first one is setting to 30. Okay, that's fine. Now, for every number in task.numbers, if task.numbers is not equal to 30, so if 30 is not equal to 30, that's good, then we're fine. But then it goes to the next one. If 30, which is our number, is not equal to 30, so they're the same number and is causing a big problem there, what we're going to do is pretty much nothing is going to happen. So we need a way to fix that. Now what I'm going to do is going to be a little bit complicated, but we're going to create a slice of the array. So what I'm pretty much going to do, and we're going to be able to apply this to all of our numbers here, is pretty much we're only going to take the array or the list that we have here by cutting off the first element. So let's go ahead and start this with add here. It's going to make everything a lot smoother. First of all, we're going to set answer to task.numbers 0, and then we're going to create a new numbers variable that what it's going to do is take task.numbers, but it's going to slice off that first element. So the way that slices work is you can specify a start, an end, and a step. So the start is going to be the starting index, the end is going to be the ending index, and your step is going to be how many times you want to go through. So 1 would just go through every one. Now instead of starting at the first element, which is the 0th index, we're going to start at the first element. So it's going to be number 1. So we're pretty much going to start here in this case. And then we're going to go all the way to the end. So the end is going to be, we don't know what the end is, so we just leave that blank. And our step is going to be 1. Now the way you can specify this is just you can remove the other two colons and go 1 colon and then nothing after that. And that's just pretty much going to say start at the first element, or the second element, sorry, and then keep going until the end. Forgot to add the S there. And what this is going to do is make everything a lot simpler, because then we don't have to run this check every time, and it's also going to remove that problem of having duplicate numbers. So if we want to add 30 and 30, we don't have to run into that bug of having duplicate answers there. So let's go ahead and copy that over for all of our operations there. And this is kind of something you need to think about in development, is looking at focusing on refactoring your code, because sometimes you can have nasty logic errors that you overlook when you're coding. So always make sure that you look at all the possible solutions and some maybe problems that can arise while you're doing this. So I'm going to go ahead and do it for all of them. Make sure to go ahead and also remove the task, because we're going through our new array. Just like that. And there we go. So pretty much, let's go ahead and look at it this way. Suppose we're adding 30 and 30. Our answer is equal to the first element, which is 30. That's fine. And then our new numbers array is going to be cutting off the first element. So now we're only left with a list. Sorry, no, I didn't mean to say array. We're going to be left with a list with one element, which is going to be the number 30. So now what we're going to do is for every number in our list here, so which is only going to be 1, we're going to add the answer and the number. So our final answer is going to be 60. So this is a lot more convenient to work with, and it's going to remove that error that we had before. So let's just go and make sure that everything's working for that. and it seems to be going fine. Let's go ahead and create our last one for divide. If task.operation is equal to divide, then we're going to go and just copy this over. Now, there are a lot of ways you can refactor this. You can see we're kind of copying the same thing over and over again. So I challenge you to go and try and find a way to shorten this up a little bit. Maybe create some sort of a map where you can have different things and search up the operations. It's all up to you. You kind of have to go and find a way to do this yourself. So just change that to divide equals. Now there we go. We have all of our 4 operations set up, and also make sure to return it at the end. And this is our operation function. So we've pretty much done the bulk of our calculator here. Let's go ahead and try this out in our program. What I'm going to do is get the user input. We're going to parse our input, or actually, why don't we go ahead and create our own operation and just work with it that way, because remember in the last video we had that bug where we had strings instead of numbers, which we're going to be covering at the end of this mini series. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to say operation is equal to, and then we're going to create an operation. So we're going to go with our standard list here. So we're going to go add, which is our operation, and then we're going to put in our numbers list, which is going to be 30 and 50. The next thing we want to do is say answer is equal to, and then we're going to run our operation. So we're going to say run operation. So this is taking the operation that we have set up here and passing it into our the function that we just created. Next, we're going to go ahead and print our answer. And hopefully this should return 80. Let's go ahead and run our program, and you can see that it prints out 80 to us. So it's working great. You can go ahead and try this with more numbers. So for example, if I wanted to add 20 here, this would hopefully give us 100. And you can see that is working great. So the last thing I want to do, which is a pretty basic function, is just print the answer back to the user. So what I'm going to do is set my answer. So I'm going to say, well, we already have our answer variable here. So I'm going to actually change this to solution maybe. Now, again, this can be any variable you want. So I'm going to say answer is equal to the string. Your answer is, just like that, answer plus equals the string, or solution in this case. So it's going to just glue our solution onto here. Last thing I want to do is return the answer. So this isn't actually going to print anything. It's just going to, well, we could make it print, but I want to save that for later. So there we go. We have that set up. Your answer is answer plus equals solution. So if you already know a little bit of Python, and you might see a little bit of things that could be improved, don't worry about that. We're going to save that for the refactors video, which is coming at the end of this mini series, and we're going to group that together with talking about proper debugging and how you should do that. So I'm deliberately creating some areas that could be improved here so that we can focus on them at the end of the series. So if you want to go ahead and, try and optimize this yourself, go ahead. You can always post your solutions, all over the place on the Video Lab website. Try and share your, variations in the comments of this video and all over, so everybody can kind of share their knowledge and their different solutions, because this is a pretty vague program. So you can create all sorts of different solutions to this calculator, and in all sorts of different ways using, methods that might be simple or complex. So I highly encourage you to go and share this with the world and kind of share answers with each other. Really get some knowledge on Python and some alternate views of making these programs. All right, I'll see you in the next video. Hi, welcome back. So in this video, we are going to be moving on and pretty much doing the last function or internal function of this program. So we're going to be running ask again. So pretty much what this is going to do is ask the user if they want to play again, and then it's not going to run all of the functions, because remember, we're putting that in our main function. But what it's pretty much going to do is ask the user if they want to play again, and if they do, they pretty much just return something which we'll be using to identify it, which is a Boolean. We'll talk about that in a second. And obviously vice versa if they say no. So let's get started. And the first thing I want to do is talk about Boolean values. So pretty much a Boolean is just a data type, just like a string or a number, and there's only two possible values, true and false. Now you have to write them with capital letters, just make sure you do that, and pretty much this can be used to identify a lot of things. So pretty much, let's just say if we go up to this if statement here, what we're doing here is this, when we write this out, it's going to either give us true or false. So pretty much what this is saying is if true, then do this, and we're just going to check if this is true. It doesn't run if this evaluates to false. So at the core of everything, and especially if statements and loops and pretty much a lot of the stuff in programming, it all comes down to these two values, true and false. So we're going to be working with them in this video. So the first thing we want to do is ask the user to play again. So what I'm going to do is create a new variable, ask again. Well, that's actually the name of the function, so I'm just going to call it again. And then we're going to set this to an input. We're going to say, would you like to, well, it's not really play again, so I'm going to say enter another command. It's getting a little bit long. Make sure to put a space there to give some space to the user. And now what we're going to do is kind of make this a little bit easy to work with. So pretty much, let's just go ahead and write some pseudocode or some comments here, see if we can get it. If yes, return true. If no, return false. So that's pretty much what we're going to do. Now, let's get started. The easiest way to do this is with an if statement. So I'm going to say if again is equal to yes. Now remember, pretty much what's going to happen here is we're going to say again, and they're going to type in yes or no or whatever we want. And we're pretty much just going to check if yes or whatever they type in is equal to yes. So if this is yes, for example, if yes is equal to yes, which is true. So it is true, and we will go forward and return true. So we're going to say return true here. And then I'm going to say here, if again is equal to no, return false. So pretty much what we're actually going to do is in our main function here, we're going to start running a loop, and it's going to get a little bit complicated, and I'll talk about it once we get there. But pretty much what we're going to do is just check the value that we get from ask again. And if it's true, we're going to do something with it. So we'll talk about that in a future video, but that's pretty much it for the again function, or ask it again function. All we have to do is use these Boolean values and make everything a lot easier. Now, this doesn't have to be true and false. We could check for 0 and 1, for example. So this could be 0 and that one could be 1. But the reason we use true and false over something like numbers or strings is because it's really easy to work with, and you won't get mixed up or have, conflicting variables if you use booleans. Because if you use numbers, sometimes maybe it can accidentally get a 2 in there or an extra number, maybe it's not 0 or 1. So using true and false really makes it easy for this purpose, and that's why we use booleans. Alright, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So in this video, we are going to be looking at formatting our functions to make it look a lot better. So I'll talk about what we mean by that in just a second, but just to show you what I mean, let's go ahead and just get rid of this, and I'm going to go ahead and run our print instructions function. And actually before that, let's go ahead and also run our introduction. So I'm going to type out introduction and run that as well. So let's go ahead and run our program. I'm just going to clear it first. So let's go ahead and see that. Now let's look at how this looks. We have our intro, and it says type your command in this format. Now all of the text is right, but the thing is it doesn't look very appealing. It's all on, no new lines. This doesn't very look like an introduction. So what we're going to be doing in this video is going through and using some special characters and just making our program look a lot better. So let's go ahead and speed through it step by step. So firstly, our introduction. This doesn't really look like an introduction. So what I'm going to do is first of all put this in caps. That could work. And just do some, keyboard art to make it look a little bit more like an introduction. So there we go, we have that ready. Now let's look at our instructions. So what we have here is one huge string with, spaces and everything like that. But what I actually want to do is move these onto new lines. So for example, I want to have type your command in this format. Oh, whoops. Should probably remove the space there since we already have one here. So it says type your command in this format, space, add 1, 2. So I want that, but then after that, I want a new line. And after that, I want some more stuff. So the easiest way to do this is with a special character called \n. So what this is going to do is called an escape character or a special character, and this is it's not going to print it in our string. So I'll go ahead and run the program for you again, and we'll see what happens. So you can see, first of all, we have our introduction, which is changed, but you can see that instead of being on one line, this possible operations line is actually moved onto a new line. So that's what \n does. And actually, just to make this a little bit better on the introduction, I'm going to put another new line character after our introduction, or I might even put 2, just to make things a little bit distinctive. So there we go. We have our introduction, and now we have this. So there we go. We've worked on our first 2 functions now. Why don't we go ahead and keep moving forward to check the formatting of more stuff. So first of all, what I want to do is also put a new line at the end of this, because pretty much what's going to happen is we're going to have our input, and I want it to come after this introduction section. So we're going to put another new line at the end of that. So let's keep looking forward. Our parse input is mostly logic on the back end, so we don't really need to work with that at all. Same is for our run operations. So now we have answer user. So this is where we start moving with more strings. Now pretty much what I actually want to do is put a new line at the beginning of our answer user. So think of this. We have our introduction, you put the input, then there's another new line, and then the answer. So your answer is, and then it prints the answer. Now what I want to do is after that, I actually want to put an ask again here, but I want to also move this to a new line. So we have 2 ways of doing this. Either we can add a \n character to the end of this line, or we can also add it, we can also print it at the beginning of this input. So we can do it either way, but just to make things a little bit just to streamline things a little bit, I'm just going to add it to the end of this. So remember, it is a character. You don't have to, do anything weird with it. All we're gonna do is add that new line character. So think of it as just a normal letter in a string, just like A, B, C, D. It's just a normal letter, but it does something special instead of, actually printing it to our line here. So there we go. We've done pretty much all of the formatting we need. Now, one thing to note is that there are a lot more escape characters than just \n, and they do a lot of special things. So for now, we don't actually need any of them, but once you start moving into a little bit more complex programs, you will use some of them sometimes, for parsing more complex inputs, trying to find certain terms in a line, and there are so many different uses for these escape characters, and just the new line character, we can see what kind of an effect that's had on our program alone. So there we go. We have that all set up, and in the next video, we're going to be throwing it all together in our main function. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So now we're approaching the end of building this calculator. We've written all of our code and everything is pretty much set up, but now we need to bring it all together and put it in our main function. So pretty much what this is going to do is run the program from start to finish, starting with our instructions and ending with our ask again function. So we're going to be putting it all together in this. Now it's pretty easy to string it all together because we already have most of the layout set up. We want to print the introduction and instructions, then we want to get the user input, then we want to parse it and run the operations, and finally answer the user and ask them if they want to enter another command. So let's get started. The first thing we want to do obviously is print the introduction. Now we don't have anything returned from here and we don't really need to store anything, so we're not going to set this to a variable. Now this goes the same for our print instructions function. We just want to work with these two. Now I'm going to go ahead and uncomment this line and run the program just to see if it's working. And you can see, it still works fine. So let's go ahead and keep moving forward. The next function we want to do is get our user input. So we're going to store this to a variable since we want to capture the command that the user entered. So I'm going to put user underscore input is equal to get user input. Just like that. Let's go ahead and clear and run it again. So enter our command, add 1, 2, for example. So you can see that obviously nothing happens, but this is perfectly normal since we haven't added our logic yet. So the next thing we want to do is parse our user input. Now pretty much this returned an operation, so we are going to store that to a variable called operation, parse input, and it also takes an input of the command that we wanted. So we're going to pass in our user input variable. There we go. So let's go ahead and check if that works now. Add 1, 2. Now it doesn't print anything, so this is working just like it's supposed to. The next thing we want to do is run our operation. So what I'm going to do is go here and let's see what it returns firstly. So it returns the answer that we need. Oh, whoops, forgot to add the return there. That would have been a pretty bad mistake. Return answer. So there we go, we have it there, and now what I want to do is run our operation based on our operation class that we have here. So I'm going to say our answer is equal to run operation, passing in what we got from our parser. Finally, the last thing I want to do is answer the user, and we will do the get again in just a second. So we're going to say answer user and then pass in our answer. And of course, this doesn't actually store anything, it doesn't output anything, so we don't need to store it to a variable. Now we have a main loop set up, but what if we wanted to play again? Now pretty much what we're going to do, and this is how most programs do it, is that we are going to assume that the user does not want to play again. So we're going to pretty much find a way to store in the computer that the user doesn't want to play again. We're going to run our ask again function, and if the user answers yes, then it's going to change that assumption from the computer to true, and it's going to continue the loop. Now what we're going to do is use a for loop. So first of all, I'm going to say again is equal to false. So this is assuming that the user doesn't want to play again. Now to make this a little bit easier, I'm actually going to change this to true, because if I used false, it would have been a really hard way to get the loop running. So just assume that for now we're going to set it to true, and I'll show you how we can just flip this completely towards the end of the video. So now we are going to say a different kind of loop. It's called a while loop. Now we've used for loops in the past, and pretty much it goes for number and it loops through a list and assumes each item. But pretty much a while loop works by saying while some condition is true or false. It depends on what kind of approach you want to take. So the way you write it is while, and then you say the condition. So what I'm going to say here is while again is equal to true. Now there are ways to refactor this that I'm going to go over in the next video, but this is going to pretty much say that we're going to run this loop as long as again is equal to true. Now we have to indent everything here. And now what I'm going to do is run our ask again function. So I'm going to say ask again. And remember, this outputs something, true or false. So what I'm going to do is say again is equal to ask again. So this is going to ask them, would you like to enter another command? And remember, if they enter no, this is pretty much setting again to false, which breaks the loop. So there we go. This is pretty much how you can use it. Now, if you wanted to say, for example, let's start off assuming that they don't want to play again. All you'd have to do is change this to while again is equal to false. And pretty much what's going to happen is that if they answer no, then it's going to set again to false. So you can kind of see why you wouldn't want to run this. If they don't want to run another command, this is just going to go back to the top and run it again. So you're going to need to change the approach that you take with again is equal to false. Now I'm not going to go over how to do that in this video, because for now I just want to, create a very basic loop where you can do this. So I'm going to say again is equal to true and while again is equal to true. So there we go. We have that set up, and now we can continue looping pretty much indefinitely. But let's go ahead and run our function and see what happens. Now we're assuming that this works perfectly. Let's go ahead and say add 1, 2. Would you like to enter another command? Now you can see that it completely just skips over the part where we answer our user. So this is a pretty big problem when we're going over this. Now in the next video, we're going to go and actually debug this and go through and see what are the problems, and I'm going to go over some pretty common techniques that you should use to debug. Alright, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So in this video, we are going to be debugging our code, and we're going to be going through fixing some of the problems we have and also refactoring some of the different things we have, because some of them are really easy to break and we could really improve our code and make it a lot more flexible. So let's get started. The first step in debugging is trying to identify your problem. So first of all, we're going to enter our command. So we're going to go add 1, 2, and there we go. Our problem is that it completely skips our answer user function there. So what's going on? Now pretty much, let's try and imagine the kind of functionality that we want. We want it to run through our answer user and it returns the answer. Now pretty much after that, in the main function, we want it to print our answer. But what happens when we do this? All it does is answer user and returns or outputs that solution, but it doesn't actually, it's not stored in any explicit variable. So what we need to do is actually store it here. So what I'm going to say is, first of all, we know that our answer is going to be equal to, answer is equal to run operation, and then we have the core number. Now pretty much, instead of, trying to go ahead and print this or do any crazy stuff like that, what we're going to do is just directly do what this function was meant to do, which was return the answer to the user. So instead of returning anything, we're just going to print the answer back. Now it should work perfectly. So let's go ahead and see that. Now obviously there are still more bugs, which I'll cover in a second. You can see it does print the answer, but something really weird is going on here. Instead of actually printing what it's supposed to, which is 3, it prints 12. So let's identify the problem. Instead of adding these two like a mathematical operation, it's instead just gluing the numbers together. Now let's try and run this with add, let's say 40, 40, and 40. Now this is supposed to return 120, but it returns 40, 40, 40. So we can confirm that by experimentation, which is again a technique in debugging, that this is just gluing everything together. Now let's start brainstorming some possible problems this. So we know that strings work by gluing themselves together. So for example, if you add the string 1 and the string 2, it gives you 12. This could be a perfect explanation for what's going on here. But if we go up here, you can see that for number in user input numbers, it is saying number is equal to int number. So why isn't this working? It's supposed to be changing the whole thing to numbers. The only problem is it's not actually doing that. This isn't explicitly changing the number in our list here. It's just storing it into a temporary variable and replacing itself. There's no actual change of this input here. So what we're going to do is instead create a new list. So I'm going to say user input numbers underscore int is equal to, and then a blank array. So what we're going, list. Now what we're going to do is we're going to keep adding to this list. So we're going to get the number from our user input numbers. We're going to change that into an integer, and then we're going to just throw it into our user input numbers int. So let's go ahead and do that. What I'm going to say is user input numbers int dot append, which is pretty much just adding something onto the list here, and then we're going to say int of number. There we go. Now what I'm going to do is, instead of using our old array, or I keep saying array, it's list, instead of using user input numbers, I'm going to say user input numbers int. Now let's go ahead and try our program. Now remember, this might not work since we're experimenting and working around. Now you can see that this returned us an error again. So what we're going to do is keep going through and trying to solve these, but before we were just getting logic errors. We weren't thrown anything like this. Now the easiest way to read an error like this, which is a traceback error or a syntax error, is to read through these and find the error of, or try to read the what you're given here. So for example, we can see that on line 75 in our answer user function right here, it says type error must be string, not integer. And what this is pretty much what we can deduce from this is that solution has to be a string, but instead it's an integer. So now we can find ways to solve this. We know that somewhere here on line 75, this is an integer. Now the easiest way to do this is to just convert it to a string by using this function. So this is going to convert it to a string. Now, of course, you're not going to have these answers off the top of your head at the beginning of your development careers. You're going to have to go online and try and find solutions to this. There's lots of sites that you can use, such as Stack Overflow, or just going around on forums and trying to find other people who have had the same problem, because I guarantee you there's probably at least a few people out there who have had the exact same problem. So you want to go and Google this, and with time, you'll get better at reading these kinds of errors and trying to find solutions to them. So there we go. We've converted this to a string. Let's go ahead and first clear it actually. And then we're going to go ahead and see if this works. Enter your command, add 1, 2. Your answer is 3. So there you go. It's working great and our program is working. Let's just make sure that this works as well. So it quits the loop and everything is running perfectly. The next thing I want to talk about is refactoring. So although everything is up and running like it's supposed to, there are ways we can improve this. Now what I'm going to do is go through and teach you how to find areas that you could improve it. The easiest way to do this is by trying to assess whether that would work, whether something would work in every case. So what I'm going to do is start with our main loop here. So you can see that we have again is equal to ask again. Let's go to our ask again function. Now, we know that people will enter in yes and no, but what if they enter something different, for example? What if they say yeah or just why? We need to try and find a way to cover every single possible case of yes and no, because obviously they can vary from these two. This is a pretty big part of, development in general, is trying to predict the patterns of what people will try and enter. And with time, you will get better at this. So now that we've identified what we need to do, we need to try and find a solution to this. The first and easiest way is to combat or make this case insensitive, so people can enter it in uppercase or lowercase no matter what. Now pretty much the easiest way to do this is to convert everything that they enter to lowercase and then check against a lowercase check. So for example, if they enter yes, converting it to lowercase will still be lowercase yes. On the other hand, if they enter uppercase characters, it will also be converted to lowercase. So the way you can do this is with .lower. I'm going to put that after the again input. So what this is going to do is convert the input to lowercase. And from here, what we can do is just check it and it will work perfectly. But we can also do more than just checking for case. What if they want to enter yeah or just the first letter? Now, the easiest way to do this, and you will notice this with pattern, is that the first letters of yes and no will always be the same. So if they enter Y or any other variation of yes or no, it's always going to be Y and N. So what we can actually do is only check the first letter. And you can actually do this using the same ways you check elements in an array, using indexes. So the first letter is going to be the 0th index, the first, the second, and so on. So what I'm going to do is use the square brackets and check if the first character at the 0th index is equal to Y. And I'm also going to check if this is equal to no, or actually N in this case. It's going to return true and false in the same way. Let's go ahead and run our program and see if this works. So I'm going to say add 1 and 2. Yes, and you can see it runs again. Now I'm going to run the same function as before, and I'm going to type something like this, and you can see that it still runs again, just as it's supposed to. So this makes it a lot more flexible than just inputting simple yes and no, with both the lowercase feature or case insensitive feature and checking only the first letter. But remember when we imported the system module at the beginning? We can actually skip this whole true and false thing and quit the program using our module that we have up here. So instead of returning false and having to check this and, run a while loop, if again is equal to no, we can just run sys.exit. Now, like I said, you're not going to know these off the top of your head. You can go and Google this by entering cases such as, how do I exit a program in Python? Try and visualize what you want to do with your program or what feature you're trying to achieve, and then just find a way to implement that into your program. So we have sys.exit over here, and pretty much now we know that as long as this returns true, it's always going to continue running. So if this is equal to no, we don't actually have to check it against any variable. It's going to exit the program immediately. So we can remove the need of this variable, because pretty much this is just going to continue running indefinitely until the user enters no, which in that case, it will forcefully exit the program. So we're going to still run ask again, of course, because we need that functionality, but we can just change that up very easily. Now what I'm going to do is run our program again. Would you like to enter another command? No. And you can see using sys.exit, it quits the program. Now, of course, there are a lot more, things that you can append to this. So for example, instead of using gluing strings together, you can use something called a format string. There's things called list comprehensions and slices and all sorts of things that you can do to fix this program. Now, of course, if I were to implement this all into this video, it would stretch over 2 hours long. So I encourage you to go and find your own refactors that you can make and post them on either the Video Lab website or in the comments of this video or any of them on this series. You can really help others and discover more about Python in the process. You can learn a lot of new features and tools that you can use to make this program better. So I encourage you to just take this as kind of, a base solution, and you can build upon it and add new features. For example, if you want to do more than just add, subtract, multiply, and divide, you can add things like exponentials, and you can even add graphing and things that are really complex if you add the right modules and libraries. So I encourage you to go ahead and take this base code and really play with it. It's really going to help your skills, and it's one of the best ways to learning programming. So just to end the video off, I really hope that you go and take this and really develop your Python skills, trying to find new solutions and features you can add to this calculator. Alright, thanks for watching the series.